Good morning, everyone, and thanks for your patience there while we just gave people a few more minutes to join the webinar. So a really warm welcome this morning to our webinar, Dementia Whole Life Approach Individual Awards Learning Event. My name's Alan Crockett and I work with the Life Changes Trust, and I'm going to be your chair for this morning's webinar. I hope you're sitting pretty comfortably and ready to go through this webinar with us. So before we get started, I just want to go over a few of the key points that you were sent in your joining notes. This is going to help make this webinar the best experience for you. So I think you may have already done this, but firstly, can you check that you are on gallery view? This means that you can see more than just one person who's speaking, and you'll find this option in the top right hand corner of the main screen. So just be sure that you're on gallery view. Secondly, could everyone have their cameras and their microphones turned off? That would be really helpful. And lastly, we will ask you to hide other non-video participants. This will give you a better experience of our speakers today. So you do this by right-clicking on your own little black box or anyone whose camera is turned off and select hide non-video participants. So just quickly go over that one more time. Just right click on your own little black box or anyone whose camera is turned off and select hide non-video participants. Many thanks for doing that. And remember, you can use the chat function at any time to post any questions or any comments that you might have throughout the morning. We will take questions after our presentations as part of our Q&A. Just to let you know, we will be recording here in the main room of the webinar, but we won't be recording in the breakout rooms. So thanks for bearing with me there just to go over some of those technical points. Today's webinar is part of a series of thematic learning events which share learning from the independent evaluations of our funded projects here at the Life Changes Trust. This event is particularly timely given its focus on individual awards and their learning and the synergy with the approach to SDS, as we know, has been very challenging, particularly for people with dementia and unpaid carers through this pandemic. Today's event adds real depth to this learning, so we hope it's something that you can take away in terms of informing your own policy and practice approaches. And we do this through the support of the independent evaluation from the lines between, and also doing this through the lens of people with dementia and unpaid carers. And so on to today's programme. So firstly, you're going to be hearing from the key findings from the evaluation of our individual award scheme, courtesy of Lorraine Simpson from the lines between, who carried out the evaluation. Then we'll be bringing you some personal stories from our individual award scheme, looking at what two families living with dementia spent their awards on and their experiences of having flexibility, choice and control. Anna Buchanan, who is the Chief Executive here at the Life Changes Trust, will look more closely at individual awards and other forms of personal budgeting from a policy context. And Shapana, Hussein, Ahmed from the Coalition of Carers in Scotland will be joining us later to talk about the findings of a survey they undertook to find out whether unpaid carers and those who care for them were aware of the new Scottish Government and COSLA guidance around self-directed support during the COVID pandemic. It also asked carers whether they had been able to use their SDS in a more flexible way during lockdown. So a really busy morning. So as I say, I hope you're comfortable and ready to get started. And don't forget, you'll have a chance to ask any questions in our Q&A section later on. So please feel free to do that at any time using the chat function. But first, with all of our projects, once we've issued funding, we also commission an evaluation. And our individual award scheme was no exception. The lines between was commissioned to carry out this work, and the report looks at where the funds were administered and what people with dementia and unpaid carers chose to spend their money on to improve their quality of life, wellbeing and day-to-day living. The evaluation also looks at the impact and learning from the individual awards. But to tell us a wee bit more, I'm going to be joined now by Lorraine Simpson from the lines between. Over to you, Lorraine.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Lorraine Simpson. I'm the Managing Director at The Lines Between. We're a social research agency based in Edinburgh. We were commissioned by the Life Changes Trust to carry out this evaluation on the basis of our experience of working sensitively with families and a history of inclusive research with seldom heard groups. I'll be talking for 15 minutes. Essentially, I'm summarising our 50-page report, which I think you've already received a link to, where we describe the individual award scheme and the impact on those involved. Over 18 months, our team collected and analysed lots of information to inform the evaluation. We had conversations with people who received the awards, 47 carers and 28 people with dementia. We spoke to 18 staff across the organisations involved in delivering the awards. We ran workshops and we looked at information gathered by the Life Changes Trust and delivery partners, application forms, monitoring forms and feedback. Our report includes lots of examples from unpaid carers and people living with dementia in their own words. I'd encourage you to read it if you have time. We've had good feedback about its value in explaining why and how the individual awards made a difference and the policy implications of this work. We wrote the report in clear language with many different readers in mind. So I'm going to cover the key themes in my 15 minutes here, but if you can read the report, please do. First of all, I'm going to talk to you through today's presentation with a quick outline of what I'm going to cover. So I'm going to describe the awards to you, the purpose of the scheme, where it took place and which partners were involved. I'll tell you who received the awards and how they used the money. I'll describe the difference that the awards made to people's lives and wider benefits that perhaps were not anticipated when people applied for the awards, what we learned about why this programme was successful. And finally, I'll share a short case study so you can see the real life impact of an award. It links with the title on my first slide, Small Award, Big Impact, Long Lasting Difference. That's a brief summary of what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to start with a short recap of what the individual awards are. So the Life Changes Trust ran a small, successful pilot of an individual award scheme in Argyll and Bute in Edinburgh in 2014. They knew they had something that worked and wanted to learn more and recognised the growing interest among policymakers in effective ways to address loneliness, improve physical and mental well-being, and put people in control of support that makes a difference to them. So building on this success, they established a larger scheme across 3 areas in 2018. And that's the scheme that I'm describing today. The individual award scheme provided up to £500 for someone with dementia or someone caring for a person with dementia in an unpaid caring role. Those who received an award could spend the money on anything that they believed would make a difference to them, and they had up to a year to do it. The Trust funded care and repair organisations and local partners in Aberdeen, Lochaber and Angus to administer the individual awards to people affected by dementia in their area. So that's a little bit about the awards themselves. We also looked at the demographic profile of those who received an award. 602 people received awards. A third of these were between the ages of 75 and 85, a quarter 65 to 74, around 10% were under 54, 59% were female, and 64% had a long-term health condition. That's a highlight of some of the features on that slide. We've got lots of stats in the report for you to look at. We also looked at where the recipients of the award were from and how many award recipients were people living with dementia or unpaid carers. Roughly speaking, the awards were split half and half between unpaid carers and the people with dementia. And nearly a third of the awards were linked, which means that 2 awards were granted, one for the unpaid carer and the other for the person with dementia that they supported. In terms of geography, half of all the awards were made in Aberdeen, a third in Angus and a 6th in Lochaber. And the vast majority of people applied for awards between £300 and £500. Half put the award towards something that they themselves also made a contribution to. So that's an overview of the award recipients. I'm now going to talk a bit about what they actually spent the awards on. We can see that the average spend amount was £467, and people could spend the award on whatever they liked. When we looked across the spend, we saw that this typically fell into one of 4 groups. I'm going to go through those categories, what people had spent their award on, starting with home renovations and gardening. A third spent the award on their home or garden. This made sense in terms of where people spend most of their time. They wanted to make the best of the environments that they lived in. But also when we spoke with families about their situation, we heard about the amount of skill, time, energy and effort that can go into maintaining a home. And people simply didn't have the capacity to do this in the way that they used to before the onset of dementia or before caring responsibilities came to the fore. Their time was absorbed. 12% spent the award on their garden and 8% on home repairs. So that was one big area of spend. Another common theme was trips, breaks, and experiences. Just over a quarter spent their reward on a break or experience. And these stories were spoken of in joyful and moving terms. The anticipation of the experience and the memory of the trips were highly valued. The short breaks typically fell into one of two types. So unpaid carers using the award for some respite, to recharge and have a short period of time for some self-care, or to spend time with their other family members in a non-caring environment, or to share a break with a person living with dementia, reconnecting with an element of their past, or to visit someone special to them, in some cases for the last time, or to make new memories together. We also found when doing our research that new furniture and appliances were very popular to support people living with dementia and unpaid carers in the home. Often this was linked to the amount of time that people spend in their home and the importance of having reliable, comfortable equipment. Some used it for IT to help them stay connected with their family and social networks. So that's a little bit about how people with dementia and unpaid carers chose to spend their awards to support their own well-being and day-to-day living. But what about the impact of these awards? All of the awards were valued by recipients, as evidenced through the feedback that the Life Changes Trust received and the details that people shared with us in the interviews. We identified 8 main types of impact. The main finding across all of the awards was the contribution to emotional well-being. 3 out of 5 said that the award helped in some way with emotional well-being. It took many forms. For example, people explained that their stress level had reduced from having something practical, like a new boiler, or something rejuvenating, such as respite care. They described things that gave them ongoing pleasure, a new DVD player or piano lessons. One woman said that she was no longer embarrassed to have visitors after spending her award on redecorating her living room. Another important impact that emerged in the analysis was improvements in physical well-being. Chairs, beds, carpets, improvements to flooring so that people didn't fall over, having a smoother path to their garden so they could go out and use that space. And these often had a knock-on effect to the emotional well-being of people as they felt better or were more able to do the things that they enjoyed. Another finding was the greater sense of feeling connected and more interaction with others. This was highlighted by some unpaid carers and people with dementia. For example, one woman living with early onset dementia put the award towards buying an iPad and used it to FaceTime her sisters who lived abroad. Her partner was at work during the daytime and she valued the company. Another unpaid carer described his mother's deterioration in mood over a period of time. He applied for an award for a new TV, and when she received that, she started to have lively discussions with him and with her paid carers about programs that she'd enjoyed watching, or things that she had plans to watch, or things that they might recommend for her to look at. Memories revived or new memories with trips of significance were also a feature in the discussions about the breaks away. One woman used the award to pay for a hotel so she could take her mother to Dundee, which she'd been asking to do for a while. Dundee held fond memories for her mother from her childhood. And recipients' comments also suggested that for some, the award contributed to a sense of financial empowerment. They bought things they might have not done, or bought something of a better quality than their budget would have allowed them to do. Others felt able to buy a treat, and there was a very real sense of treats being out of reach for some of the unpaid carers we spoke to. Things like travel, hobbies, family events, all of these things became more possible because of the small budget that was available. Prevention was another theme in terms of impact. Some of the practical projects or practical help that people received reduced hazards and saved people from struggling to fit in activities that were threatening to overwhelm them. In turn, this reduced stress and worry. Combined, these small but important changes promoted independence and supported people to be able to continue living independently in improved environments at home. Long-lasting. Some of what's already been described will clearly have long-term impacts. The new equipment that will last for years, and the new memories made that can be meaningful for years to come. One practical example, one woman in Angus dealing with the early stages of incontinence said a downstairs toilet had improved her daily independence, emotional well-being, and made her daughter and other carers' lives easier. And connections to support. Some said that as a result of getting involved in the awards, they knew more about what their local care and repair team or dementia enablement service was able to offer them, and they had received help with other things, such as equipment that was useful, or even accessing benefits that they didn't know that they were entitled to. Far-reaching, finally. Beyond the award recipients, there were knock-on effect for others. The circle of family, unpaid and professional carers and wider family relationships as some stresses were removed and aspects of emotional well-being improved. For example, adult children described their relief at seeing less stress in their parents' home while one parent was caring for another. And de-escalating some of the stresses at home helped people cope with their caring role, and in some cases resulted in new forms of unpaid support coming forward. For example, an unpaid carer used the award to go on a break and arrange for her sister to come and care for their mum for the first time while she was away. She said that as a result, her sister's understanding of what was involved in her daily unpaid caring role had increased. She started to absorb what it meant to be helping her mum with the toilet, with changing seats, and of keeping her company and not being able to go out herself. And she said that that kind of new understanding of what she had been doing had really improved the relationship between the two sisters, and her sister had got more involved. So clearly there are some very tangible impacts, but what we also found was that there were some knock-on effects which led to secondary impacts. Through one example of practical spend, I hope to demonstrate the many changes brought about by a smaller world that might not have been envisaged on paper. So you can see here the cleaning and gardening services that one couple used the award for. They told us that this made them able to enjoy their home and garden, which had been a really important part of their lives together. And spending time in an enjoyable way at home gave them more energy. The husband, who was a carer for his wife, talked about his kind of stress around wanting to keep up that environment and being conscious that he needed to spend time with his wife, and that was kind of draining the energy that he had. So he felt more energetic because he didn't have to worry about those things. And then because he was spending less time on those activities, he was able to do more activities with his wife outside the home. They would go to the golf club, or they would go out for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and they were spending times with other people outside their home more than they'd done before. They had better quality time with friends and family, and both of them felt more socially included. So that was the feature of them being able to enjoy the home and garden, but all of that added to more time for them together, a reduction in the levels of stress that both of them were feeling. His wife said that she felt less lonely because her husband wasn't often about spending time trying to fix the garden, and both of them said that they felt happier as a result. So we've heard about the positive effects that these awards have had on families and individuals, but what's the wider learning from the programme? Here I want to summarise features of the award scheme that we identified as critical to its success. Firstly, simplicity. It was a very simple application process, and this was crucial for engagement. It was very clear that complicated applications were off-putting for households for many reasons. For example, people having to get their heads around complicated changing situations at home, engaging with different services, already having high levels of stress, putting them off getting involved in something new, or having a to-do list that was also very long. So having a simple process was important to them. Flexibility was another important feature, and the inherent flexibility in how the awards could be used made applicants feel trusted and able to take control. They were able to use the award for best effect on something that reflected their specific needs and circumstances. And although we'd identified the 4 key types of spend, within that, people use things in very different ways depending on the specific needs of their family or their home. Trust, support, reassurance, face-to-face contact from someone that they already knew and who knew their situation from the local care and repair team and partner organisations was a really important element. People are unlikely to access the award without this route in. And when we had conversations with unpaid carers and people with dementia, they said that those first conversations when the award was introduced to them, it was really important that that came from someone that they knew and trusted. The personal approach was also important. So using the local delivery partners meant that people had support from someone who was friendly, knowledgeable. They helped them understand how the awards could be used and why the opportunity was there. And again, that helped people to feel in control and reassured them about the application. And the non-prescriptive nature of the scheme provided freedom, dignity, and choice. And we found these key to unlocking the potential of people directing their own support. Before I go, I just want to introduce you to Betty. Betty used her award for a new walking fame. Before applying for an award, trips in her life had kind of been reduced to the essential. So typically to the doctors or maybe the supermarket. And whenever she went out, she needed her family with her to drive her there. She wasn't walking about. She now has her own wheels. That's what she called the walking frame that she got through the award scheme. And she enjoys walks with her family members and getting fresh air and exercise regularly. I'll give you a moment to read the comments from her family. So that's really a general whistle-stop tour of our evaluation. I hope you found this presentation useful, and I'll look forward to answering your questions in the panel discussion later. I now hand you back to the safe hands of our event chair, Arlene.
Many thanks, Lorraine, and your presentation really has brought that report to life. So thank you so much for that. I think what is very clear is the impact of the awards at that point in time for people with dementia and unpaid carers, but the long-lasting benefits that it has, not only to those that receive the award, but other family, friends and the wider communities. And I especially liked the reference to some of those small things that people don't often do for themselves, buying treats and doing something really quite special that matters to them. So many thanks, Lorraine. That was a really good presentation. And as Lorraine has said, she will join us later in the Q&A session later. So if you've got any questions for her, then please put them in the chat function. So now we wanted to bring some of those personal stories, which Lorraine mentioned, to life from our individual award scheme, and to look a little bit more at what people living with dementia and their unpaid carers have spent their awards on, and their experiences of having flexibility, choice and control. Our friends from outside the box took 2 of these stories and turned them into animations. We hope you enjoy meeting the Johnson family and Anne and her family. So over to the animations. Well, I don't know about you, but I think those are absolutely fantastic, and huge thanks to Outside the Box for doing that for us. I think they really illustrate so well the impact of the individual awards on those people with dementia or unpaid carers who have received them. So many thanks to Outside the Box. It's just a wee bit of a different way, I suppose, to present some of those case studies. So we're delighted with how they've turned out. So next, we're going to talk a wee bit about the policy context. Anna Buchanan's going to join us now to present about some of the broader policy and legal context in Scotland based on the learning from the individual awards. I'm not going to say any more than that, other than to hand over to our Chief Executive, Anna Buchanan. Thanks, Anna.
Hello everyone. My job really now is just to reflect on where some of the learning from the individual awards fits in with the broader policy and legal context in Scotland. This is not an exhaustive summary of the policy and legal context in Scotland. What it is just looking generally at where some of the learning might fit in, especially in light of discussions around social care in Scotland right now. You will have your own thoughts and you'll have the opportunity to discuss those in breakout rooms later on, and we'll be very interested to hear what your own thinking is. So the first thing we're going to reflect on is this year, which looks quite exciting from the pictures in front of you. This year was 1968. And while these exciting and somewhat sad things, including the assassination of Martin Luther King, happened in 1968, in Scotland, we had the introduction of the Social Work Scotland Act. And I just want to reflect on what that act said over 50 years ago. It spoke about payments being made in kind or in cash in order to meet need. And it also spoke towards the end of this quote that you see on the scale about the preventative nature of some of this provision and the importance of early intervention, albeit the wording there says it's about not causing greater expense to the local authority on a later occasion. However, what I just want to point out is that for over 50 years, we've had the idea of direct payments and cash and in-kind services in our legislation, and also the idea that early intervention and prevention is important from a fiscal point of view. And as we see the legislation and policy develop, we'll see that it's not just about the fiscal side, but it's also to do with how that benefits individuals in society. And that takes us through to the Self-Directed Support Act and other relevant legislation and policy. So in 1996, local authorities were given discretion to make direct payments to people. In 2002, there was a bit of a review of what was going on with this, because in 2003, the direct payments were going to become a duty rather than a discretion. And it was recognised in 2002 that there was a slow take-up of direct payments, and we don't really know all the ins and outs of that. But what we do know is that some money was allocated to a project that was managed by Direct Payments Scotland in order to do the 4 things bullet pointed there about increasing awareness, developing support, establishing a national information service, exchanging good practice, and also identifying and addressing training needs. And it's good that a lot of that work was obviously done. I think really what we're seeing through the work of the individual awards and also the wider work of the Life Changes Trust and others is that there's still a lot more to be done in relation to provision of direct payments for people living with dementia and unpaid carers. So this little diagram, sadly 2008 is missed off there because my picture is over it. But this is just a development of what's been happening in the previous years leading up to this year. And you can see there's been an emphasis on self-management strategies for people with long-term conditions, with the Alliance really leading a lot of that work. Self-directed support strategy, caring together the carer strategy, which then really resulted in the Carers Scotland Act in 2016, the 3 national dementia strategies, self-directed support legislation, integration legislation, and then really culminating this year in a very brief review of adult social care, which will report in early 2021. So there is no shortage of policy and legislation that has kind of led us to where we are in terms of direct support for people living with dementia and carers. And specifically, the Social Care Self-Directed Support Act and the Carers Scotland Act have had a significant impact, at least in policy and legal terms, for carers, if not fully in practice as yet. So we just look briefly at the statement of intent, which is from the statutory guidance for self-directed support legislation. And you can see how the emphasis here is not just on meeting critical and substantial need. It's about supporting, promoting, protecting human rights and independent living. It's about coming in with practical assistance to allow people to participate in society, live an ordinary life, not just to intervene in a crisis. And importantly, the aim is to ensure that care and support is delivered in a way that supports choice and control over a person's own life and their right to participate in society. So good stuff. The description is good. The principles, I'll come to the principles in a moment. Let's just remind people quickly what the 4 options are. These are the 4 options for social care provided through the means of self-directed support: direct payments, allocation to an organisation of the person's choosing, person choosing to allow the council to arrange and determine the services, or option 4, all 4 of these. I think it's important to reflect at this point that recent stats from the Scottish Government on uptake of these options amongst those over the age of 65 shows that option 3 is far and away the biggest option that is used, which perhaps suggests there could be some more work done around options 1, 2 and 4. So back to the principles I referred to earlier. These are the 8 principles that undergird the notion of self-directed support, which includes the ability to make direct payments. And this is where the connection with individual awards really comes in. So we have these 8 principles. I think if we were reflecting on them, we'd probably say that we don't see quite so much around innovation and risk enablement as might have been hoped. We don't mean that is the case in every situation, but our general understanding based on what we're seeing and work that we've commissioned is that more could be done in those areas. And these might be something you want to reflect on in your discussion groups when you talk about how individual awards might have some learning to inform this. Just a brief note on carers and SDS. We are often told in conversations that carers don't have a right to SDS, but the reality is that they do. They have a right to self-directed support. That doesn't mean to say it's easy to get, but they do have a right to it. And they also have rights under the Carers Act. So just briefly, they're outlined there. Local authorities are required to provide information and advice. They must have a carer support strategy. Carers have a right to request a support plan. All 4 options are open to unpaid carers to support them, and charges cannot be made for support provided to carers. The logic there being, why would you charge someone for providing a service that you would have to provide if the carer stopped caring, which then takes you through that circular argument of why we're not supporting carers more so that they don't fall on their knees and have to give up. These are some publications from work funded by the Life Changes Trust over the past 6 years. We have the green ones, the dark green ones are those that came out of the MECOP project, the Rights, Respect and Responsibilities project. That project found that awareness of self-directed support and applications for it were few and far between. The purpose of the project had been to support people with any challenges they would have to make to decisions, providing advice and support where they felt that they had been perhaps treated unfairly and wanted to have their case looked at. It was a legal project. So as a result of that, we produced, MECOP produced with funding from the Trust, Dementia SDS and Promoting Individual Autonomy, a guide to self-directed support for people with dementia, available on the Trust website. And also Tim Haddle, who's an advocate, wrote the publication Challenging Social Care Decisions in Scotland. You also see there on the left, the evaluation of the Dementia Enablement Pilot Project. I'll talk about that in a moment. In the middle in blue, the evaluation report of the pilot project around individual awards that the Life Changes Trust funded before the scheme that you're hearing about today, and also a report by Community Catalysts about some of the individual experiences of people living with dementia and carers in accessing self-directed support. The Dementia Enablement Pilot Project worked in tandem with the individual awards scheme that we're hearing about today. And the reason for that was that we saw a lot of interchange between what people needed in the home in order to keep them there, to keep them living in their own homes and in that place that they found was secure for them in an emotional sense as much as a physical sense, and not be moved elsewhere. And that's what the Dementia Enablement Project was about how could you use small amounts of money in order to cut through the red tape that is traditionally there around small adjustments in the home and make small and early changes in the home, primarily as part of post-diagnostic support, in order to make the home a better place to be. We all had found in the pilot project of the individual awards, a middle report, that many people wanted to do things in the home for exactly the purpose that the Dementia Enablement Pilot Project was set up. So we decided that the Dementia Enablement Pilot Project and the individual awards scheme, which is the final report on this slide, could work in an interrelated way to cross-refer between the two projects, so that if people applied for an individual award but had a need in the home, they could refer to the other project and not use money that was intended for the home enablement project for individual awards, or vice versa. So in order to influence the discussions that are going on just now around social care in Scotland, we really need to have evidence to be able to do that. And much of this evidence is contained in those reports that you saw on the previous slide. So what we learned from the 3Rs project, the MECOP project, was that most people with dementia and unpaid carers of people with dementia are not really being offered the 4 SDS options. This is not true in all places, and there is good practice. However, it is our evidence that it is true in most places. Secondly, there is a considerable need for further training in SDS and dementia. When MECOP found that they really didn't have many cases to take up in terms of challenge because people were not accessing SDS, what they did was they upped the level of training that they were providing, and it was greatly appreciated by those who received it. And further training in SDS and dementia is most definitely needed across Scotland, because dementia is quite specific when there are specific needs in relation to dementia and SDS. Thirdly, no one really knows how to challenge social care decisions through complaints routes or legal routes. Those that do try to do so usually find they're quite exhausted once they get through the first few stages. And this is why we had Tim Haddle write the guide that he has written. And lastly, there's very little expert advocacy for people with dementia or unpaid carers of people with dementia. And that's something that I think we need to reflect on, as well as a right to advocacy for people with dementia and unpaid carers. Secondly, in terms of what we've evidenced, we really need to talk about the individual awards scheme and the Dementia Home Enablement Project, and what we found through that, and what you'll be hearing today through what's been said previously and what will be said later, is that a small amount of money goes a long way to enabling people. Secondly, direct payments enable support to be fully personalised, and it's really important that that happens in order to get the maximum benefit from them. People can be trusted to make good decisions about their own needs. We see that time and time again. When we offer individual awards through the Trust, people are quite absorbed in the need to make a good application that is not frivolous and is not just out to get the most amount of money. Freedom from red tape leads to swifter and better provision of support, which is again one of the reasons why we funded these projects, particularly the Dementia Home Enablement Project. You can read a lot more about that in the report on our website. And also, the how is as important as the what and why. The current policy and legislation sets out very well the what and why of why we have self-directed support, and particularly why we have direct payments. The how is better explained, and we would say that the learning through the individual awards pilot and the subsequent rollout of the scheme really say a lot more about the how you go about this in order for it to be effective. So what is the current social care context? You will know about the Independent Review of Adult Social Care, which is chaired by Derek Feely. I hope a number of you have had a chance to meet with him or submit evidence to that review. One of the points we've made in our submission to the review is that unless health and social care integration is well integrated with housing and community-led provision, then we're really not going to get any further forward than where we are already. We also have a question about what has happened to the early intervention and prevention agenda, and would like to see that much more highlighted and explained in any new adult social care system in Scotland. Also, it's clear that there are links between social care, small direct payments and post-diagnostic support. Post-diagnostic support is not a legal right, it is a policy promise. We know that not everyone is receiving the support that they have been promised, but we do think that there's a lot to be looked at in terms of the review of adult social care, plus the Dementia Transition and Recovery Plan that Scottish Government are currently working on, and the promise of post-diagnostic support. So the learning from individual awards could certainly be integrated into learning around post-diagnostic support. And then lastly here, Social Work Scotland is leading work on standards for self-directed support, and they currently have an open call for comment. They're asking you really what you think the standards should be. And to our mind, those tie in very much with the principles that underpin self-directed support. We reflected a little bit on what those principles are. You can see the 8 that were there, and then in pink we've added in 6 more, which we think really flow from the learning of the individual awards scheme. And those are that the administration of self-directed support should be trusting. We should be trusting people to know what their needs are, and trusting them to use money responsibly. It should be a transparent process, self-directed support. It should be flexible. It should be simple, not simplistic, but simple for people to navigate. It should be person-focused, and it should be outcomes-focused. And again, it would be good to reflect on those later. And then lastly, just want to draw your attention to the wider work of the Life Changes Trust, much of which is explained and contained in these 5 volumes of Dementia, A Whole Life Approach, available on our website and soon in hard copy, as well as a box set. In these volumes, what you will find are a number of ways in which direct payments, other payments, free services can be delivered in more innovative and whole life approach ways. By a whole life approach, we mean taking account of a person's whole life, what makes up who they are as a person, not just the condition that they have. So it's seeing the broader picture around someone living with dementia and a carer who's living with dementia as part of their life as well. So we'd encourage you to look at that, to sign up for the newsletter that will go with that when it's available in the early new year, and also to attend more of these webinars that we're having under the banner of Dementia, A Whole Life Approach. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope that your discussions later on are fruitful.
Many thanks, Anna. And as you say, there's a whole body of information and learning there that people can take onto the breakout sessions later on this morning's webinar. And as Anna said, Dementia Whole Life Approach is is a really good opportunity and good tool for people to engage more deeply in terms of the evidence that's out there through the experience of people with dementia and unpaid carers across Scotland and the services, organisations and projects who support them. So Anna will also be joining us for our Q&A later this morning. So again, just a reminder to post any comments or questions in the chat function. And it's time for me to introduce Shapana Hussein Ahmed, who is the Partnership Development Officer at the Coalition of Carers in Scotland. Shapana is going to talk to us about the findings of a survey undertaken by the Coalition. The survey wants to find out whether unpaid carers and those they care for were aware of the new Scottish Government and COSLA guidance around self-directed support during the COVID pandemic. It also asked carers whether they had been able to use their SDS in a more flexible way during lockdown. So I'm now going to pass over to Shapana to tell us what they found. Over to you, Shapana.
Thank you, Arlene, and thank you to Life Changes Trust for the invitation to come along this morning and share some of the work that we've been doing around understanding the experiences of unpaid carers using self-directed support during this pandemic. Before I do that, I did think originally that it would be useful to perhaps say a little bit about what self-directed support is and the different options that are available with self-directed support. However, as you'll see, Anna's covered quite a lot of this already, so I think rather than go into too much detail at this point, I think it's perhaps worth just reiterating that self-directed support is there to enable people with support needs and unpaid carers to have more control, choice and autonomy over how their support is delivered. And those who meet the local eligibility criteria for social care support should be offered a choice of all 4 options. Of course, we know that with the pandemic, it brought with it many changes to the way in which support and SDS was being delivered across Scotland. So let's take a look at what happened with SDS when the pandemic hit way back in March. So at the start of the pandemic, around March time, a number of things happened which impacted on social care support. We had care providers who had reduced or shut down their services. We had care staff who were being furloughed. We had households who were shielding. We had people who did not want outsiders coming into their homes. All of this ultimately led to people with support needs and unpaid carers having to go without essential social care and support. In response to this, the Scottish Government and COSLA issued some additional SDS guidance in May. So this guidance was asking councils to allow those on SDS options 1 and 2 in particular to be able to use their budgets to purchase alternatives, to allow more flexibility in what that support looked like. We carried out a short survey to see whether this was something. So as I was saying, we were hearing that people weren't being allowed to use their budgets in a more flexible way. So in June, we carried out a short survey to see whether this was something that was happening across all local authorities or not. So we had 208 carers respond to that survey. And I'm just going to highlight some of the findings. I'm going to begin with perhaps some of the more positive findings. So around 1 in 5 carers had been able to use self-directed support budgets in a more flexible way to support a loved one during the pandemic. However, it is worth noting that this also means that around 4 out of those 5 carers were potentially unable to use their SDS budgets in a more flexible way. And that's something we'll come back to in a bit. But for now, I think let's take a closer look at those who were able to use their budgets more flexibly and look at what kind of things were carers and people with support needs using their SDS budgets for. And there were a variety of things. And one of those things was around accessing digital support. So a number of support organisations had now moved to only providing support online, and restrictions on meeting people from other households meant that many people were now far more isolated in their own homes. So some folk were able to use their budgets to purchase laptops, iPads, or subscriptions to Zoom to keep in touch with friends and support groups online. We had family carers able to use their budgets to be able to purchase subscriptions to things like Netflix or digital concert halls to allow them some time off from what was effectively now a 24/7 caring role at home. So accessing the digital world was obviously very important to some carers, and others used their SDS budgets on more practical things or things that helped with more general well-being. So for instance, we had bike sheds and washing machines. We had a whole variety of items being purchased, ranging from exercise equipment, art materials, musical instruments, household appliances, and garden equipment. So basically anything which met an individual's outcomes, bearing in mind that outcomes for most people would have changed during the pandemic. So this was very much about what do people need right now to be safe, to maintain their well-being, to help them continue with their caring roles. And as long as it was legal, this should have been, in theory, a fairly straightforward process. There were also some carers who didn't necessarily buy any new equipment, but they used their SDS budgets for more direct assistance. So this is where they were able to choose what tasks they needed support with and when they needed them. So this included people paying their PAs, their personal assistants, to carry out different tasks from normal or for doing different or additional hours, which perhaps better suited the needs of the person that required care. Now, it's worth stating that this choice over hours and tasks should have been happening anyway, regardless of whether there was a pandemic or not. And it's one of the findings that many of us have found most surprising, I suppose. It's just really curious, I think, that it's taken a pandemic for people to feel that they are allowed to actually decide their own hours or activities that they would like their personal assistants to undertake. So, while some carers use their budgets to access support from external resources and services, there were others who looked more to their own families. So this included paying relatives to provide additional support at home, particularly where care providers were unable to provide any services or where the household were shielding. So the SDS guidance that was issued in May made particular reference to the fact that the pandemic was indeed an exceptional circumstance and that family members may be the only and safest care option for many who required support during lockdown. So, as you can see, some carers were able to use their SDS budgets in a flexible way in a range of different ways that suited their needs specifically. But it's probably worth highlighting that there were others who were not even aware that this flexibility was available to them. In fact, 60% of the carers in our survey were unaware that self-directed support budgets could be used to purchase alternative support or could be used in a more flexible way. The COVID-19 SDS guidance, which I referred to earlier, stated that local authorities should proactively communicate how SDS options 1 and 2 could be used during the pandemic. It's obvious that this wasn't happening in practice. Those who were aware of the guidance told us that they had found out via social media or through friends or other carers and not necessarily from their local authority. So while, as we can see, there were many carers who weren't aware of the flexibility they could have, there were others who quite simply were just not allowed. So in fact, 43% of carers who requested to use their self-directed support budgets more flexibly were told that they weren't allowed to do that. A further 27% are still awaiting decisions or were awaiting decisions around whether they could or could not use their budgets flexibly. Some of the reasons given to carers for not being able to use SDS in a more flexible way included firstly, that the SDS budget had to be used to continue paying existing care providers or services. Now that's not strictly true. Some were told that the SDS budget could not be used to purchase items and that they should instead contact a charity if they wanted to use their budgets to purchase items. That again is also not true. SDS budgets, so another reason people were told was that SDS budgets could not be used in a flexible way unless the supported person or unpaid carer were in financial hardship. And again, surprise, surprise, that is simply not true. In some instances, there were no explanations provided by the local authority for rejecting the request to use SDS in a more flexible way. So as we can see, there were obviously barriers that some carers experienced to using their budgets flexibly. And one of those in particular was around employing relatives. So around half of all carers who had asked their local authority if they could use SDS to employ family members during lockdown were told no by their local authority. Some were told, in fact, that this was an inappropriate use of direct payments. Only around 1 in 4 carers who asked to use SDS to employ family members had had their request accepted. In some instances, that request was only granted after the carer challenged the original decision. For some carers, the request to employ family relatives was only granted with fewer hours, and there appeared to be also very little support for carers who had taken on the role of an employer for perhaps the very first time. So, for example, they might have previously been getting an option 3, but had now decided to take an option 1 in order to become an employer. It's worth pointing out that there is certainly support available to those who use SDS to employ people. And again, the local authority should have made them aware of that support. Carers should not have been left to just get on with it. So as you can see, there have been a range of different experiences of self-directed support during the pandemic. Unfortunately, not all of them have been particularly positive. So one of the things I think we should be considering now is what do we want self-directed support to look like in a post-pandemic world? So I guess much of what we would like to see with regards to self-directed support as we move beyond the pandemic, hopefully at some point, are things which in theory should have already been in place. So for example, greater transparency and accountability in the decision-making process. People are still waiting for decisions on whether they can use SDS in a more flexible way. In some instances, we have people in the same local authority where, depending on who their social worker is, some are being allowed to use their SDS in a flexible way and to purchase alternative support, and others are being told that that is just not allowed without being given any reasonable or valid reason. Now that shouldn't be happening, and reasons for rejecting requests, as we have found, have often been quite nonsensical and really not in line with guidance at all. Number 2, there needs to be greater flexibility and personalisation of support. Again, this is something which should have been happening prior to COVID. So I've talked today about some of the good examples of people being able to use their budgets in a more flexible way. However, during the pandemic, I can't help but feel that the councils have perhaps missed out on a huge learning opportunity here to allow people to use their budgets in a novel way to meet individual outcomes. It would have been, I think, a really great way to evaluate what personalisation of support could actually look like when you trust people to make their own decisions about what support they need in place. So number 3, what people needed during this pandemic were social workers who could help them navigate this new landscape that we had all found ourselves in. What people didn't need were gatekeepers acting on behalf of local authorities. People with support needs and unpaid carers needed to be trusted to make decisions about how to meet their own outcomes, and social workers should have been enabling that and supporting those efforts and not preventing that due to the perceived budget constraints of local authorities. Social workers that I know, and I think many of you here will know on a professional or personal level, know that social workers usually go into that profession to affect change and to enable people with support needs to effectively live their best lives. So, you know, it's about, let's encourage that and make it possible for social workers to actually do that in future, be enablers rather than gatekeepers. Number 4, information and guidance about self-directed support needs to be accessible for all, and that goes without saying, really. And this includes staff as well as people with support needs and unpaid carers. Our survey highlighted that the majority of unpaid carers were unaware that they were able to use self-directed support in a more flexible way. And this despite the guidance stating that the information should have been communicated in a clear and transparent way to people using support. The information around SDS and how people can or cannot use it should have been made available in a variety of accessible formats, both online and in print. All local authorities and partners should have shared this information as widely as possible through their networks, connections, and in person. Doing so would have potentially improved the quality of life for disabled people, for people living with long-term conditions and unpaid carers alike. Number 5, there is also a need for reduced bureaucracy in the system. The time taken for decisions to be made about whether somebody could use their SDS in a more flexible way was just an absolute huge source of stress for so many carers and the people that they were caring for. At a time when the system needed to be responsive and flexible, we were still finding that individuals' requests were being delayed due to bureaucratic processes in place. Again, give social workers more autonomy to make some of those decisions around how budgets can be used. And finally, I think we need to acknowledge the crucial importance of the role that the third sector organisations play, which includes local carer organisations and SDS organisations, and the role that they play in providing people with information, advice and support, and to be encouraging local authorities to work more closely in partnership with these local third sector carer and SDS organisations. It's obvious from that quick sort of rundown today that there is still a lot to be done to make SDS more of a level playing field and as flexible, clear and personalised as possible. But I think many of us are hopeful that this can be achieved, and can I at that point just say thank you for your time today. If you would like to read the report from the Coalition in full, you can download it using the link on the page there, which will be forwarded on to all attendees. If you'd like to get in touch with me about the report or the work that we're doing, my contact details are there. And can I also just quickly take the opportunity to bring to your attention the SDS Collective. There's a bunch of us, we're basically a group of individuals made up of people who access SDS or organisations that support individuals who receive SDS. We meet up at the moment every Wednesday lunchtimes via Zoom. The link's there to find out more information, or drop me a line if you'd like to join us, and you'd be more than welcome to. And that is me for now. I will now hand you back to Arlene. Thank you very much for your time today.
Many thanks, Shapana. And well recovered from that connection issue previously. That couldn't have been easy, so well done. This is a really important survey, and it really adds depth to the evidence and the learning that we've heard so far. And I'm not sure if the Coalition has any plans to do the survey again, but it would be really interesting to see if there has been a shift in people's experiences now that we're more than 6 months into the guidance being issued, but we'll wait and see if that's something that Coalition might want to do. So now it is time for our breakout rooms. We're going to now look at the learning in a little bit more depth, particularly the findings of our evaluation and how we think we can best take things forward. So welcome back, facilitators. So we have 4 of you, but we only had 2 rooms. I don't know if you've decided between you whether you're going to feed back a theme each or one person's going to do it from each room. So I'll hand over first of all to Carol and ask Carol to share some themes from her breakout room. Over to you, Carol.
Thanks, Arlene. I mean, firstly, just a wee apology to my group, because I think we started to run out of time. It was a really animated discussion in a definite sense, that people could have spent a bit longer talking about the information that they've heard today, and also just generally their experience around this topic. So yeah, but I think there are a couple of sort of strong themes kind of coming through as we were talking about it. And what we were saying was that there's actually quite a lot of strong evidence and some really good practice now around personalised budgets, self-directed support, and that in itself might not actually be enough with this topic to really prompt some of the changes that we would like to see. So there might be something about campaigning, really utilising the voices of unpaid carers and people living with dementia, for them to kind of highlight the difference that this has made to them. And certainly the point made by Lorraine that when that evaluation work was happening, people were very eloquent, they could talk very articulately about the difference that the individual award had made to their lives. So that was quite strong, I think. And then the other bit was about the culture and just people, explaining some of their experiences of different guidance and criteria in different local authority areas, some of the blockages, the things that get in the way, apparent budgetary constraints, although, we challenge some of that. And whether we can shift the conversation more onto early intervention and prevention as a way of kind of tackling some of those cultural issues. And then just to repeat a little bit, there was mention at the end of the importance of groups like the SDS Collective and how effective they've been actually, particularly during the lockdown period, at highlighting some of the key issues.
Thanks very much, Carol. That's really good stuff that's coming out of that, and interesting around the campaign element. So it'll be interesting to see what others think about that as well. And I think you're absolutely right. The consistency element has coming through kind of loud and clear that things are pretty patchy, and that means that people's experiences then reflect that. So thanks very much, Carol. So who's going to be feeding back from the other session, or are you all having a turn each? Andrina?
I'll feed back, but Mary, please feel free to jump in. So yeah, quite a few points. I think the main one was, yeah, we do tend to focus on budgets, but actually the real issue here is a reluctance to empower people. And that word of trust that runs through the individual award scheme is really key, trusting people to be able to know what their needs are and how to meet those. I think another point that was made really eloquently by Jerry is that when someone is applying for self-directed support, they need it now. They don't need it in 3 years' time, because with dementia, obviously, your dementia journey is going to be different next month or next year, and your needs are going to change, and you need to have something that's flexible enough to change along with you. In terms of sharing good practice more widely, there are some good examples. East Ayrshire was highlighted, and can we have a template that can be used Scotland-wide? If things work well in East Ayrshire, then why can't they work in the rest of the country? We also had a very interesting comment around eligibility criteria, and if we have a need for eligibility criteria in the first place, then that means that we're focusing on someone who's in crisis or who has to meet criteria, and then that's taking away from the early intervention and prevention agenda, which should be what we're focusing on. And then in terms of what needs to happen next and who do we need to work with, we talked a bit about COVID and how many great examples there were of community resilience and community support, and how we need to build on that, and we need to use that going forwards. And the statutory sector can learn a lot from the voluntary sector and third sector in terms of reacting quickly, being flexible, and just being able to provide peer support. So we talked about people with dementia who are actually just supporting each other because there aren't any services available. They've just taken the initiative and set themselves up as a group, and they're supporting each other. And something like that, you can do flexibly, and we need to really learn those lessons from COVID. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add, Mary. I'm sure there's something I've forgotten.
No, I think you've covered everything. Similarities between some of the group discussions there. Yeah. I think for me, not necessarily being in this sector, I think one of the things that struck me was just that difference between the intention of SDS and the actual reality of people's everyday lives and trying to access it. And then when you compare that to the individual grant scheme, that the intention of that seemed to play out in the way that you wanted it to. So that seems like one of the biggest things to be putting that message out there, that you can actually do these things and meet the words that you put out there as well.
Yeah, and it shouldn't have to be a battle when you're already dealing with a lot already. Okay, I think that's everything. Thanks.
Many thanks, Andrina and Mary, and also Carol and Charlie. I think you're right. I think we see that quite often in the dementia world, and I'm sure in other sectors around, the real gap between the policy and then the practice, you know, at that kind of experiential level for people that it most affects. And I think, you know, Andrina's absolutely right. There is a lot of learning that we can build on from the people's experience through COVID. And we had a really interesting discussion yesterday, actually, with people with dementia and unpaid carers as part of the consultation and the Scottish Government's Dementia Recovery and Transition Plan. And that's what people with dementia were saying in particular. You know, we've managed, you know, to weather the storm. You know, we've done things ourselves. We've supported each other when other services were not there to support us. So don't go back the way to, you know, caring for us. Actually look at how we can work together for things to shift and shift that paradigm. So yeah, really interesting to see that coming through as well as part of today's learning. So it's up to me just to say many thanks to facilitators and to bid you farewell. Okay, so moving swiftly on, it is now time for our Q&A session. And I'd like to ask our panel now to join me on screen. Hi everyone, welcome back. We obviously seen you all this morning earlier on as part of your presentations. So thanks for staying on and joining us as part of our Q&A panel. So first of all, I'm going to ask you all to briefly introduce yourself. So Shapana, would you like to start?
Hi, good. Are we in afternoon yet? Yeah, we are just on afternoon.
Yes.
Afternoon. So I'm Shapana. I am the Partnership Development Officer at the Coalition of Carers in Scotland.
Thanks, Shapana. Welcome. And Lorraine?
Hello, I'm Lorraine Simpson. I'm Managing Director at the Lines Between. We evaluated the individual awards scheme.
Welcome back, Lorraine. And last but by no means least, Anna.
I'm Anna, the CEO of the Life Changes Trust.
Okay, welcome everyone. So we have some questions to get started, and can I just encourage people that are on the webinar today, if you've got anything else that you would like to ask our panel, now is the time to do that. So quickly put together your thoughts and reflections and put it in a question into our chat function. So Lorraine, this first one is for you. So what would you say, based on the work that you've done in terms of the independent evaluation, what would you say was one of the kind of key elements of the individual award's success?
So I think it was kind of the things that I focused on the end of the presentation, the simplicity of the application process and the fact that it was a supportive process, which meant that those who were applying for an award, you know, did that in a way that felt comfortable with someone that they trusted, someone that could talk them through like how they might use an award. Because I think although the flexibility was really, really valuable, you know, in terms of the outcomes that were achieved, actually at the start, that kind of blank piece of paper of think about how this award might be able to help you, that was quite daunting for people. And there was this big sense among many that they didn't deserve it, that if they had this award, that it would be taken away from someone else. So having the local partners involved in the delivery really helped that conversation to go, no, you are entitled to this, and here are some ways think about your situation that it might benefit you. And so, you know, the staff told us and the recipients told us that actually the kind of initial conversations where ideas were thrown around, that wasn't necessarily what they ended up using the award for, but it got them really starting to think about what would make a difference to our family. And that's how people started to go on those different paths of, let's get something practical that could help us in a number of different ways. Maybe we could use it for an experience. So that was key. The trust element, that they were trusted to use that money in a way that, you know, would help them, was good, and that feeling of being in control. So I think that delivery, that the program that was set up, you know, the learning from the pilot, which informed how this program was set up, and the principles of the scheme worked really well.
Thanks, Lorraine, that's really helpful. And you and others have spoke about the ripple effect of the award. So, and these sound just as important as that kind of immediate impact that you've also shared through the case studies, and also we shared through the animation. But probably more so in some cases, that ripple effect has been really important. So maybe a question for Anna we'll get started with is, how do you capture those indirect benefits for people, that kind of ripple effect that was described by Lorraine much earlier?
I suppose it depends on the context we're talking about. You know, if we're talking about it through an evaluation, then there's only so much you can capture because you're in a period of time. I think through both the pilot report and the report by Lines Between, we have managed to identify you know, quite a number of those ripple effects, which would include as well, not just the effect for the individual of seeing this happened and it meant that, you know, so something happened in the garden and it meant that our social world has opened up, or, you know, we're not ashamed of our house anymore, so we allow people in, which will then give us access to information and support that we maybe didn't have before. But I think there's also the ripple effect within families as well, who understand that if something, you know, like if they as children perhaps were to, you know, put together, you know, £500 a year to help mum and dad, you know, what would that do? In terms of capturing it, I suppose we capture it indirectly through a number of the projects that we fund, because we're always getting reports in from them. And the other angle on it is really local authorities themselves who are administering self-directed payments should have better mechanisms in place for capturing not just did we do what the paperwork told us to do, but what was the overall effect. And I think that's what's linked to the early intervention and prevention agenda. If we want data around that to capture the ripple effects, which might then explain better what it is that it has prevented, then that would be a much more effective approach in terms of data collection. And then just finally, sometimes we just need to use our imaginations. We can just look at it and imagine ourselves, you know. That ripple effect means this, you know, it means that there's been money saved there, or there's better relationships there.
Thanks, Anna. That's really helpful. And just talking about that culture change and early intervention, one of our attendees have asked if anyone, and this is open to the whole panel, has anyone experienced or seen any examples of where there has been positive culture change towards early prevention or intervention, either around SDS or otherwise, that we could learn from? Anna, you're nodding your head.
I'm just saying that I think Orkney would be a good example. They've recently just launched this is in a dementia context, they have launched their new refreshed local dementia strategy, with the purpose being that if the support and everything is there at that early stage, right from the point of diagnosis within the community, so at the minute someone's diagnosed, whatever they need information-wise is just there right in front of them, at that, you know, physically in front of them. Whether they want it or not at that stage is another matter, but they know where it is. That in itself, that very, very simple step of having the support right next to the person at the point of diagnosis, that's a huge issue. And if you could also have at that point of diagnosis things about alterations in the home, things about, you know, individual awards, you know, through SDS or whatever, just having that wraparound at that early stage, whether or not someone wants it at that stage is their choice, but to have it there, we're seeing that has an impact, and that's something that we're evaluating in Orkney shortly.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, so moving on to some of the kind of outcomes or the lessons from the survey, Shapana. There seems to be an inconsistent approach to SDS from what the survey told us in your really good presentation from that this morning, as well as information about it as well. So what do you think is needed to improve the experience for unpaid carers when trying to access SDS? And also this would apply, I suppose, in some cases for people with dementia as well, but I know your survey was more around unpaid carers. So can you maybe talk about what some of the improvements might be to make things better?
I think some of those were essentially the last slide that I put up. So some of it was around what did we learn from what people were telling us about what was happening in the pandemic, but what do we already know about how self-directed support is generally rolled out. So some of those things were around, there needs to be greater transparency, there needs to be reduced bureaucracy. Basically everything that your project did needs to be sort of transposed onto a self-directed support, because the sort of individual awards programme, that essentially is how self-directed support should have been happening. It should have been working. It should have been that simple. It should start with an idea, a vision that people have. It shouldn't be, and I think there's something about the fact that we talk about social care assessments, it feels like it's something that you are being tested or assessed on. Under the Carers Act legislation, we are now talking about conversations, which is what it should be. It should be a conversation. I think so many people say to us, even now, oh, I don't know about self-directed support, it's such a hassle. And then they say, I wouldn't know what to ask for. And you think that's the wrong way of approaching it almost. The starting point should almost be the sort of, tell me about your life. Tell me what is it that sparks life in your, sparks sort of joy in your life. Let's start with that. It doesn't matter if that service doesn't even exist. This is what your package will help you to do. This is certainly not a dementia example, but if I can just quickly give you an example. So my husband has a neurological condition. For years, we had SDS quite early on in that journey. His care package looked like somebody used to come into our homes, literally get him out of bed, get him dressed, and put him back to bed. Basically, that was his care package. We took control over that package. We then asked for an option 1, whereby we had control over that budget. His package now looks like, so this was somebody who used to be very active prior to the condition sort of taking over his life. So he now, through his SDS budget, he was able to purchase a sports wheelchair. He now attends wheelchair basketball, wheelchair tennis. It's given him a whole new lease of life. It started with an idea, what sparks joy in your life? Sports sparks joy in his life, even prior to, as I said before, his condition. So let's start from that, because that's the thing that will literally get him out of bed every morning. It's the thing that he aspires to do. It'll be different for different people. So, we had the question earlier on, Arlene, about templates, and I sometimes think that we don't need templates. I don't necessarily want somebody in East Ayrshire or Glasgow or something saying, oh, let's all fund sports wheelchairs. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is start with what the individual wants. If we start with that, we can come up with a whole range of ideas. So it's about, some of it is about starting with the person, reducing bureaucracy. And I think there is also something about the fact, the role of social workers, and I know I've highlighted that in my presentation as well. But there is something about the fact that social workers need to be given almost, permission to be enablers rather than gatekeepers. I don't know how we address that today necessarily, but it's certainly I think a huge barrier to how we then move on in terms of even the other question around culture change. We can't unless we address some of that.
And just staying with that theme, Shapana, when you mentioned social workers or care managers, whoever is supporting the kind of delivery of SDS, you talked about in your presentation about, some people not either being made aware of it or being refused. Was there any reasons behind that? Was it financially driven? Was it just a lack of awareness or education on the part of social workers? Was any examples given about why some of those barriers were in place?
People were given reasons, and I think, I tried to, I suppose, be a bit polite in my presentation, and I think those of us who understand SDS know that the reasons that they were being given were utter nonsense. We were being quite blunt. Unfortunately, people don't know that. So when people are asking for support and they are being told, people are being told, you can only use your SDS for alternative support if you are in dire financial need. That really is utter nonsense, because that person has already been assessed as having those social care needs. You know, this isn't about their dire financial need. What they need now is a bit of flexibility. So there's something about individuals having that knowledge, because I think often people end up not getting pushed, but it's not a process that they really have a lot of knowledge about, you know. So there is something about you know, so the SDS collective that I sort of talked about before is one example of that. People need almost a sort of like a peer support network where others are going through the same thing, who can sort of tell them stuff. You know, the things that I know about my caring role, the majority of that I have learned through from other carers. It hasn't been through an agency or an organisation. It's been through sharing experiences with others. And so there's something about enabling that space, you know, to allow people to chat to others who have been through that, and who can almost sort of say to them, and who can say to them, actually, what your social worker just told you is nonsense, because people can't challenge unless they know that what they've been told is wrong. So there is a bit of a gap there, I think, around you know, people having that sort of knowledge to be able to challenge in the first place.
Yeah, thanks, Shapana, and that's really helpful. And I think, I mean, a lot of what we're doing today is all obviously sharing the learning and, you know, taking account of what evidence is out there. So Anna, do you think then there is, because it is about looking at solutions moving forward, you're right, it's about highlighting where there is, you know, inequity and where things aren't going well, but it's about how we then look at solutions to move forward. So Anna, in terms of what the government is consulting on now, particularly around dementia, for the recovery and transition plan, is there the particular key messages or learning that, you know, that we can be talking to them about based on what we've heard today, and some of those kind of key points as identified by Lorraine and Shapana?
If there was ever a time to be talking about individual awards and self-directed support, this is it. Yeah. Because we're in the process of looking at social care, and without going into all the ins and outs and the reasons for, you know, why that's been commissioned, we're in that process. We're also in the process of looking at a dementia transition and recovery plan, and we all have oodles of evidence to contribute to that, you know, depending on where we work. But there's also an opportunity to address the culture around social care, and I think it would be fair to say that some of us are a little bit fearful that we might step back into a more medical model of care. And so I just think that any of us who have the opportunity to say anything around a social model of disability, about enabling, about transparency, about trusting people, we should be taking that opportunity where we get it and creating it. If anyone hasn't yet been in touch with Derek Feely with evidence from their organisation, I encourage you to do so. Because that report will come out in the early new year. And although the SNP has already announced that they're going to have a National Care Service as one of their policy promises, the report will still come out. And I think it would be good, you know, if we could have as much evidence as possible in there from some of the stuff that we've learned today. And certainly our response to that is on the Life Changes Trust website if anyone wants to see that. So now is the time. And in our group, we also talked about the role of activism. And we're seeing more people with dementia, more carers becoming activists. COVID has given a chance, as Arlene said, for them to look more at that peer support that Shapana, you were just talking about there. I think we also need to emphasise the real importance of peer support. A lot is said about befriending, and befriending is a good thing, but peer support is where it's at. And we need to be talking about that as well, as vocally as possible. And in that way have a kind of indirect campaign around it. Does that answer it, Arlene?
Yeah, I think that answers it well, and more, but that's brilliant. Thanks very much, Anna. So we're now at the end of our Q&A session. So I just want to say many thanks to our panel for staying with us and joining us for this session. I think you'll all agree that it's provided that added learning and depth of discussion that I'm sure people are looking for. So thanks again, panel. We are now coming to the end of today's webinar. I just quickly want to draw your attention to our Caring for the Carer Fund, which is currently live just now and closes on the 22nd of January next year, so 2021. We recognise that during the pandemic, unpaid carers especially have been significantly impacted, and what they need now is practical support amongst many other things. Today's evidence demonstrates the impact of small grants to unpaid carers and to people with dementia, and so our approach was to offer small grants of up to £1,000 to unpaid carers to apply for support that fits their needs and wishes. So the Caring for the Carer Fund was launched on the 24th of November. One size fits all is not helpful, hence the reason why we want to provide people with an opportunity to direct what type of support that they need by applying for the fund. We have already had an overwhelming response to the fund so far since opening on the 24th of November, over 120 applications and counting, and expect this to significantly rise over the next few weeks into the closing date of the 22nd of January. I see Deborah has posted a link to the fund in the chat. Information can be found on our website through this link. And it's just to stress that this is a Caring for the Carer Fund, so applications will only be accepted directly from carers. And there is a number of ways that they can do this, either online, they can do it by having a form posted to them, or trust staff are happy to complete a form over the phone with them as well. So can you please share amongst your networks if you've not been aware of that already. We will also be capturing the learning from this fund and publishing a report in the springtime that expresses some of the challenges and the key themes around for carers of those who have applied for this fund, and looking at that as part of our influencing work as well. So we are at the end of today's webinar. It's been a real pleasure to share this, and I hope everyone has enjoyed it and will take away some, if not all, of the learning from today. I would like to thank our speakers, Lorraine Simpson, Shapana, Hussein, Ahmed and Anna Buchanan, and of course our facilitators from the Life Changes Trust. Thanks to you all. I would also like to give special mention to Outside the Box for that fantastic animation. It really illustrated the impact for unpaid carers and people with dementia so well in relation to the individual award. So thank you so much for that. And I know that some have already asked if that's going to be shared, and it will be. I also want to thank all of the staff behind the scenes who have made this happen, both from the Life Changes Trust and also from our tech support, HCVF, who make this all look very seamless and very easy, but I can assure you there is a lot of work goes behind the scenes to make this happen. We will email everyone with a link to the recording of this webinar in the coming days, as well as posting information on our social media and our e-bulletin, including some of the links to the report, etc. And finally, just another huge thank you to everyone who's joined us today. As I say, I hope it's given you some food for thought, allowed you to reflect, and hopefully we'll take that learning to your own practice areas and also share it with colleagues and others as part of your network. So goodbye everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.